think policy sets intention. But think about what your policies are saying before you even know that someone is expecting or starting their family. What support do you have in place for those individuals that might even want to think that they start that journey?
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Plumm Pod, where we talk about all things HR and mental health. I'm your host, Georgia, and founder of Access HR. In today's episode, I'm joined by Kellie Nedelcoux, HR professional, parental transition and leadership coach. I won't spoil it for you. This episode is so good. And if you are interested in understanding how to improve your parental strategies for a better future of work, this is the episode for you. Kellie, hello.
Hi.
Welcome to the Plumm Pod.
Thanks. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. So I have been following you on LinkedIn, and I'm really, really happy that we're able to take the conversations on there in person into the studio. And for today, we're really going to talk about parental transition.
Yep.
And I would love if, first of all, you can start off by setting the scene a little bit for our listeners. There's a question I love to ask every single guest, and that is, was HR part of the plan, or did it happen by chance?
That's a great question. And no, it did. It was not part of the plan. I didn't have a plan. I admire people that do have a plan, but no. I went to school, didn't do super well on my GCSEs or my A-levels, and decided that at that point university wasn't for me. And I just went to find a job. And I was very lucky to land a role with air traffic control as a HR assistant. And so I started there. And actually, it was the perfect role to start in because as HR assistant, you really get a good grounding of policy, process. And at that point, it was, a lot more admin heavy as a HR assistant than maybe it is now. But I feel like it just gave me such a good grounding. So no, it definitely wasn't the plan, but I ended up absolutely loving HR and all the different segments that come with it.
I also really agree with being junior in HR. And even from my perspective, when I was junior, technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. And I learned so many core foundations that I still carry with me now as an HR professional as well. So throughout your career, you've advanced from a more junior role to being more senior, where you were head of HR at Sky. And then you've now transitioned into your own business, career and parenthood. So talk to me about that.
Gosh, such a story. So I absolutely loved my HR career, and I feel really fortunate that I got to work in global roles, which I think gave me such a great perspective on different cultures, different ways that we work. And I also got to spend some time working in the Middle East as well. And so really enjoyed that as my HR, with my HR hat on, and actually got to spend time in different industries. So I never really stayed in one particular industry either. For me, I went where I had inspirational leaders or where I thought that the organization was trying to do really cool things from a people perspective. And as part of my journey, I spent a lot of time with leadership teams, and we talk a lot about coaching and coaching people. And they got to a point where I thought, okay, well, I need to know what this coaching is, and actually if I say I'm coaching leaders, I probably should go and do some qualifications and learn what it does really mean. So I did some coaching qualifications, some what was always like a life coaching qualification, which I really enjoyed because it really gets you deep into individuals' values and their purpose and their motivations and drivers. And then I did leadership and exec coaching qualifications as well, which is much, and team coaching. So much more in terms of how we're operating with our teams and our culture and how you're showing up as a leader. And so I really loved that. And I played in that space for a little while alongside my role as head of HR at Sky. And then when I was pregnant, I was expecting my first daughter, things just suddenly started to shift for me a little bit. And actually I saw a little bit more how hard it can be to be pregnant or expecting in the workplace. And I started to get some anxieties. And at that point, I pivoted my coaching approach to start working with individuals heading off on maternity leave and those returning from maternity leave as well. And so it started to evolve from there.
And what's the biggest challenge that you see returning parents face on their return to work?
So I don't think that there's one big challenge, because I think it's really important that everyone's journey into parenthood is different, and it might look different to every single person. And so that's really important. And so there can be so many different hurdles or challenges that people might want to overcome, whether that is for them as an individual personally, because it is a significant life change, it is a transitional period, or whether it is from a workplace perspective. So I wouldn't say that there's one, but I'm really happy, I'm sure we'll jump into these about some of the potential workplace challenges as well.
If we talk about this from an HR lens, are there any particular strategies or thought process that we should be having as HR professionals for our parental returners in terms of how we can support them further with their return?
Yeah. So I'm going to take one step back, actually, because you're talking about parental returners, and I think it's super important. So when I started coaching maternity returners, I did focus on those heading off and returning from maternity leave. And that has grown significantly. And now I work with all parental returners because, as we know, every family is different and it impacts people differently. And I truly, truly now know and believe that organizations and leaders need to consider the whole family. It's not just the person that might have taken an extended period of leave at a certain point in time. So just to kind of point that out there for you. And in terms of strategies, the way that I work with my clients, so we work predominantly B2Bs, we work with organizations. And the reason being is that I want to try and help organizations challenge some of their systemic norms, look at any biases that they might have in their organization, and how can we fundamentally change this so that we're evolving the culture of the organization in terms of their thinking about working parents and parental returners. And so when we're thinking about what strategies HR can put in place, I think it's important to first understand, why are we doing this and why it's so important? And that's where I always come back to. And thinking about employee engagement, thinking about employee retention, thinking about employee attraction, as well as productivity. And if we go deeper, we now know that the reason that there is a gender pay gap is to the motherhood penalty. The motherhood penalty is a fundamental reason, and 80% of the gender pay gap is due to the motherhood penalty. That was in a recent report that was released. And we now know that the reason there isn't as much gender balance in leadership is because when women return from maternity leave, they might take a part-time role or take a step down or exit the workplace because they don't see how to make it work. So if I go back to original question and strategies, first thing to do is understand actually, why do you want to look at this and why is it so important?
And how can we start to have those conversations at work to understand, why is it important? So I'm just thinking from the perspective of somebody who's sat listening thinking, okay, but how do I do that?
Yeah. So there's different elements for me. There's cultural elements and there's operational elements as well. And I think one of the first places to start is maybe looking at your data and drawing metrics and drawing insights from that. And rarely in my experience do we track and record and think about parental transition and thinking about all parents as part of this, however they came to parenthood, and those metrics within our organizations. And so I think a real core place for me to start, and something I ask every organization I work with, is what's your attrition rate within the first 3 years, for example, of those returning from parental leave? But what's your promotion rate? What does the career transition look like?
Oh, such good questions.
So I think it's really important to start with the data and the metrics. And if you want to do some research, have some conversations with people, maybe run some focus groups, for example. And that might be with people who aren't yet parents, but might want to do that in the future, as well as those that have also returned from parental leave, potentially recently, and your working parents in the organisation. So it's quite a big population of people that we're thinking about.
Super valuable. And I love how you've been talking about all parents. And unfortunately, HR is still quite traditional in policies as well. From your perspective, have you noticed any organisations not considering all parents and focusing specifically on parental returners?
I think it's something that's changing and evolving, and I really, really am loving seeing that. Lots of organizations have got communities, they might have ERG groups or networks that focus on families and carers, and I think that's important to bring in the caring element as well. And so I think that there is now more of a recognition that it is hard to juggle. And I think we're the second generation where typically both parents now want to work and do work. And the way that we work, the world of work, the 9 to 5, that is not set up for two working parents. That was something that was put in place, many, many years ago. Never has really been rethought about until we've now got flexible working. But it's never really been thought about. And yet the world of, our lives have changed since then. Often all parents want to be present. We need to have different ways of working to allow that equality for all parents, fundamentally.
You spoke just then about ERG groups.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate what that stands for?
Of course. So an ERG is an employee resource group.
Okay.
So in larger organizations, for example, you might have a network or a community, or sometimes it's called an ERG. And that is normally where a group of individuals have come together, recognize the importance. So it's normally more employee-led, recognize the importance of recognizing a certain, population of people. And it brings community into the workplace, and it brings allyship, and it brings support for individuals. So with family networks, what I see working really well is where people are sharing, here's the challenges, but here are some of the strategies that really work for me. Or they've set up buddy schemes, for example, which I absolutely love, so that when someone's returning from parental leave, you have a buddy in the organisation. So if you've got questions to ask that you don't want to go to your leader with, for example, you have that buddy, you have that person that's been through this journey recently as well. So I think that if they're done well, networks and ERGs can be super powerful in an organisation for people to feel supported and that they have that community in the workplace as well.
Do you have any examples of companies who have got that right with the groups?
Definitely. So I feel super fortunate that I work with incredible organisations that want to make a change, which is probably why they're talking to me in the first place, I guess. But there are a number of organisations that I work with where they are really trying to be transparent and create more conversation. They're bringing the leaders on the journey as well. And I think that's super important that leaders understand what's happening for individuals. I work with organisations where we've put the buddy scheme into place and it's worked really nicely. But one of the ways that we work with larger organisations is we might work with the ERG or the network, and we go in and we do workshops on a quarterly basis, for example, to provide tools or strategies for individuals, but also to create that sense of community. We work with a number of expert speakers who will come along with us and give talks around different elements of parenthood that people might be struggling with. Because we return from parental leave, and at that phase in our lives, we might be a bit probably sleep deprived. We're trying to navigate this new normal of the juggle and having a small child still that might be going into childcare. And we sometimes forget that children still need us the whole way through our lives, but the challenges that they might face at that time just change. So when they go to school, the challenges and what they need from their parents change and evolve. When they're going through qualifications, there's just that child's need from their parents doesn't stop, it just changes. And so what we are trying to do is to support working parents wherever they are in that journey.
From my perspective, I'm not a parent, and I absolutely love everything that you've just said, because I think because of my personal lived experience, thinking about those changes I hadn't thought about. So hearing them is so nice. And also it's like a light bulb moment of, why have I not thought about that? And potentially others are exactly the same. And I think that's where your work is shining through, because you're absolutely right. There are so many points throughout our parenthood that we will experience. It's not just we return from leave and that's it. There's so much more that we can be doing as an HR function, as a supportive work environment, to make sure that our people are supported in every experience of their life.
Yeah.
You were talking then about leaders.
Yes.
You spoke around plenty of strategies that you do. Have you found that there's one in particular that's the best way to educate leaders, or one that they're more receptive to, maybe?
So any support that we offer with organizations, we always include the leader. So whether it's one-to-one parental transition, whether it's group coaching, depending on the size of the organization, we always run leader sessions or do a one-to-one with the leader as well. And the reason being is that I think in my experience of being in HR for 20 years, I think leaders most of the time want to do the best by their people. But often what I see, particularly in that transition of return to work, is that there might be some biases or perceptions coming up that the leader isn't meaning in a, they mean it in a supportive way, but it comes through. So as an example, a leader might assume that somebody doesn't want to do evening events anymore because they now have a child, or assumes that they don't want to go for promotion or they don't want to develop in their career. Whereas actually, 63% of women, I think it is, returning from maternity leaves, this is based on the women, are more ambitious on return to work. So to answer your question, I think it's about supporting the leader as much as you can as well, so that they can have those conversations, because I think some leaders, it can feel daunting. They don't want to make a mistake around flexible working, or there's so much news about discrimination. And we know that maternity rights are being extended. So I think the leader wants to do the best that they can, but often isn't sure where to start, or isn't sure how to have a conversation about, do you need to express at work? Do we need to help find you a space? What, when you return to work, how can we support you? So I think for the leader, it's about including them in those conversations. It's about supporting them with some of the evidence, helping them with some of the, how they might want to support that individual return into the workplace, for example. I've seen group sessions work well, because then leaders can ask the open questions and we learn a lot from each other in group sessions, and also one-to-one as well, because then the leader feels comfortable and safe to ask the questions. So if you're working in HR and you're a space where you can have that one-to-one with a leader of someone's returning to work, I think that can be really powerful as well.
Knowing everything that you've just said, what can leaders be doing to support individuals who are also preparing for parental leave, not just returners, but for the preparation side?
So it's really important to actually have the right conversations before somebody even heads onto parental leave, as well as on return. And I think some of those conversations that I would always encourage are, what do you want to do with your career? Have that career conversation. What do you think you might want to do on return to work? Now that might change, because so much can happen when you grow your family, or if you go on parental leave. But it's a really important conversation to have in advance, because you want your leader and HR, if you work in an organization where you're connected with your HR, to know what you want from a career perspective. Because if there are changes within the business, if promotion opportunities come up, it's really important that you are still considered for those, even if when it comes up, you've changed your mind. So I think in advance of somebody going off, I think important conversations are very much around, what do you want to be happening with your career? How can I support you? What do you think you might want to focus on your return to the workplace? I encourage people to have an end of year review, even if it's not end of year review time. Make sure you've had some feedback. Make sure you know how your year went. And particularly if you are out over the PDP process or end of year review process, do you want to know what your rating is? Is it possible you can have that in advance? How do you want to be communicated with at that time? And these are often things that people don't necessarily consider, but actually everything that you can do before you head on leave is going to help you prep for a smoother return to work journey as well. So as a leader, I think sit down and be supportive, be empathetic, but have some of those more rounded conversations with the individual. And I think, consider when somebody's going on to parental leave, what do you want to have achieved before that point? Sometimes we set goals for the whole year and someone might be going off halfway through. What is really important that you've achieved by that point? So I think there's some of the things you can do before somebody goes off. And it's really important to consider return as well. And in the UK, we have keeping in touch days or KIT days. they're not global. But if you have keeping in touch days, or if you are comfortable to speak to your leader before your return or speak to the individual, it's super important to start that re-onboarding conversation. What does your onboarding period look like on your return to work? What are the expectations on both sides, the leaders and the individuals? What does success look like? That might be after 1 month or 3 months. But I always liken it to a new starter in the workplace. A new starter has, hopefully, a grace period, an onboarding process. They're given support. They are given documents and the people they need to meet. I think it should be similar for returners, because most businesses change drastically. If you're out of the business 6, 9, 12 months, there's going to be new people. There might be new team members. There might be new products. There might be new stakeholders or clients. So how can you best set that person up for success on return to work?
Kit days are so valuable, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And I found in my experience, there is potentially one or two things happening. Firstly, the employer doesn't understand how they work. And then secondly, it's not communicated to the team member, who then doesn't know what kit days are, how they can benefit from them. And I completely agree. So much change happens over those 6, 9, 12 months. And that's a way that we can start to really support our returners.
Yeah.
I completely agree. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Have you, in your experience, I'd be interested to know, have you found any good examples of how your clients or employers have communicated kit days in particular?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a key conversation before somebody goes off is, if you want to do kit days, because they are optional, what would you like to be doing with those kit days? And that can be normally whatever the individual wants. It might be a team meeting. It might be they go in for a lunch. It's completely up to you and your leader to scope that. And the reason that's so important is, I've seen individuals that have gone in for kit days and their leader hasn't been there, the team hasn't been there, and that is the start of what can be a really daunting process, or feeling really unsupported by the business. And from a leader's perspective, they might be thinking, well, the person's worked here for years anyway, so they'll know what to do. They'll be comfortable coming back in. But actually, for that individual where your whole life has changed, you've been trying to keep a small child alive, you might be sleep deprived, you're coming in, and it can feel daunting because you're stepping back into the workplace. So what do you want to get from your kit days? What might you want them to look like? What's going to be really important to you is a really good conversation to have. And also, does the individual want the leader to reach out to them, or do they reach out to their leader? I'll share one of my personal experiences, and I will caveat this. My leader was brilliant when I went on to maternity leave, but when I turned up for a keeping in touch day, my badge had expired, and I had my daughter in the car with me. She was only 6 months old. I was still, she was tiny. I was still really nervous about taking a 6-month-old out and about with me. And I remember it was raining and they wouldn't let me into the car park. And I had to get out of the car, get her out of her car seat, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it actually can feel like a really big deal. In the rain, walk to the security hut for them to call various people to let me in. And I just remember at that point thinking, I already feel anxious doing the drive with my daughter, and then having to get her out in the pouring down rain, take her into the security hut to try and get my security badge working again. It just didn't feel like a very smooth process. So it's really small things like that where let's try and make people feel valued.
And can have a huge lasting impact.
Huge. Yeah, huge.
Because also we want to know that we are being thought about and that our employer is intentional with their strategies. You've given such amazing tips, and I know for anybody who has potentially considered this as a strategy piece as well will have come away and thought, I actually haven't thought about that, but it means so much.
Yep. To that point there, I think some of the other things that I always would talk to individuals about thinking about is consider from a policy, there's operational perspective and more of a culture perspective as well. And they're two very big things. And I think policy sets intention. Mm-hmm. But think about what your policies are saying before you even know that someone is expecting or starting their family. What support do you have in place for those individuals that might even want to think that they start that journey? And also, I think, make sure that you're sharing some of your policies or your intentions on how you support families externally, because we talked about talent attraction at the very beginning. And it's really important, if you can, to be transparent with how do you support your working parents or your future working parents in the organisation. And the more that organisations can have that on their website, talk about it in job descriptions or however they're advertising, I think that that just really helps them to come across as that family-friendly employer as well.
And what's one policy that you would recommend any HR professional to really pay attention to?
I think there's so many different policies, but I would say really think inclusively. Would this work for the whole family? And I think that's really important. And if you can, make it as equal as possible. And I do appreciate that's an impact and a cost to the business. So it's not right for everybody's business right now. But what can you do to create that as equal as possible, but really be inclusive about everyone's journey into parenthood and even before that as well. So, for example, IVF, surrogacy, adoption, or you have it however you are coming into parenthood. That might take different time for you. It might put different stresses on the individual. So really thinking inclusively up front. And also I think loss is really important to think about as well.
In the UK, we're not as progressive with our family leave and legislation. So you spoke then around IVF.
Yeah.
So in Australia, they have legislation around that. I am noticing companies having more progressive policies, and they're taking that initiative themselves to think beyond the traditional ways. Let's talk about best practices. So what approaches would you recommend to be more inclusive?
My gosh, where to start? I think, if we come back to our cultures of organizations and thinking even about psychological safety and the importance of that. And if I take a step back, in my experience of years in HR, when you became a leader, rarely do you get training on what it means to be a leader. You might get a little bit about what it means to be a manager and some of the practical things you do, but rarely do you get that upskilling or that education around what it is to be a leader. And you have some individuals that are natural leaders and some individuals where I think they might need a little bit more support to get there. And so I think talking about things like psychological safety and what that means to individuals. And in the topics we're talking about today, that might be about people feeling comfortable to speak out loud about the journey that they're going through, or the support they need from the workplace, for example. And that might just be a little bit of flexibility about going to a different appointment, for example. Or on return to work, it might be about parenting out loud. And I really love what Elliot Ray's doing around parenting out loud at the moment. But how do you make sure that you're being inclusive with all of your team members, but allowing people to talk about what is impacting them from a personal perspective as well as a work perspective as well? And so just thinking about, I think, bringing policies to life, because as I said, policy is an intention, but often a policy is placed somewhere. It can be hard to read. I know for me, there's policies that I've had to read them like 10 times and I still don't understand what they mean. Like, how can we make them as simple as possible? And that's someone that's worked in HR for a long time. So making policies as simple as possible, and as open as possible as well. So make sure that they're shared, they're easy to find.
The message behind what you're saying, for me, is so important. You spoke then around parenting out loud. And I think, unfortunately, discussions around starting a family are still not as welcomed and progressive as we would love to be. And I do think you just started talking then as well around culture and having a culture where celebrating and expanding your family is celebrated is such an important piece because there are a lot of people who will plan to expand their family, but if they don't have that psychological safety internally, it's going to cause a lot of damage to the culture.
Yep. And if you think, we often will think about the birthing parent or the person that's taken maternity leave. Rarely do we have conversations with the non-birthing parent or the dad or the person that has taken a shorter period of leave. And they might be returning to work within 2 weeks. And they are certainly going to be sleep deprived. They are probably going to be wanting to be at home to support their partner, or spend time with their baby and grow that bond with their baby as well. And I think rarely in workplaces do we ask those individuals, how are you? What support do you need? How can we be a bit flexible? And I think flexibility in culture is really important as well. But I would when we're talking about thinking about all parents, let's make sure we're thinking about the person that might not be taking as long a period as leave as the other person, and what support do they need as well.
Outside of those questions, is there anything that you've noticed that the person who's not taking the extended leave have been really receptive to? Any examples that you've got around strategies or, I don't know, particular conversations or something where they've actually thought, oh my gosh, like I am being seen for my period of leave as well, and the extension of my family? Yeah.
I work with an organisation who offer parental transition coaching to all parents. And actually, I have probably the same amount of the person that's had less leave come for parental transition support as I do the person that might have taken the longer period of leave. And that's really telling for me, because it just shows that people now are more comfortable to talk about the fact that there are challenges that they're having. You know, there's big changes to a relationship when you have a child. And so there's the non-work perspective, but there is also the work perspective. I've got different demands in the home, but how do I still show up in the workplace and show that I'm dedicated to my career? And that's a big concern, I think, for a lot of people. So how can we be supporting people and making them feel like we know your career is important to you, and we will continue to work with you on what that looks like?
We've spoken around parental transition quite a lot today, and I do feel like we could take up so much more time and keep going. And I'm just going to end with one last question. Yeah. So the question is, looking back on your career, what is one piece of advice that you would give your younger self?
I think be bolder and braver in what you're doing. Give things a try and just learn from your mistakes. And I really love that I'm seeing now mistakes almost being celebrated and learnt from, because I think that's so important, and particularly in the workplace. So I think it would be that. And I've stepped into that in the last few years, being a bit bolder and braver, because we spend so much time at work that I think we have to enjoy what we do.
So much time at work. Yeah. Really important message. Be bold. And I also think trust yourself, trust your gut. Like, a lot of the time we're incredibly worried about potential impact, but more often than not, if we trust our gut, everything will work out. Everything is fixable at the end of the day.
It is.
Kellie, thank you so much for joining me. I've absolutely loved this episode.
Me too. Thank you so much. It's been brilliant to be here.